Before we start talking about the film, Gandhi,
Yeah.
the Gandhi Return to Gandhi Road, you did do
Yeah.
a bit of music stuff here in New Zealand for quite a while. So just give folks a little overview of what your involvement was over the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Mum and Dad were started Hegan Entertainments in 1960. And that was a company that eventually ended up managing Billy T. James and a whole lot of other people, as well as being a sort of cabaret agency. So I was kind of brought up around the
Right.
entertainment scene, as a kid.
Yeah.
And I went away overseas and I studied all things Indian sitar for 7 years in India.
So let me ask you, how old were you when you were studying sitar?
I started when I was about 19. Yeah, in India.
It seems like a totally foreign instrument to me, so I'm just amazed that you can play the thing.
Well, there were sort of two steps to my, if you like, to my studying sitar. The first stage was I went to live in India, and I said, in my mind, we'll stay about a year, then I'll go on to London and join a rock and roll band and be famous.
Right.
And so I learned for a year at this place called Shantiniketan, which was a university village town
Right.
in West Bengal that the Kangyur Rinpoche had sent me to, because there was a Tibetan teacher there, a Tibetan language teacher there as well. So I studied for a year there, and then we ran out of money, and I went to London and landed right in the right place. And the bands lived actually on our street, so it was just right at that time.
Oh man!
And one of them asked me to join the band,
right?
And I decided, and they just had been given they'd had a manager who was a lord somebody who had all this money, and they were going to buy all this gear and make a record, which they have since done and made, and are very famous, or quite famous. But I thought, what am I going to do? Am I going to stand there? And excuse me if I trivialize this. This just does. It's a bit of a delicate spot with some people, but at that time, playing rock and roll meant playing 4 chords and making it look really hard.
Right.
and I couldn't do that. So I went back to India, and via getting some money together, and went and continued my studies with a whole different teacher, really seriously, for 6 or 7 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing.
And then I came back to New Zealand because Dad got sick, and someone had to take over the family, or help with the family business, the entertainment business.
Very
good. That's the background for that.
Yep. So what did you end up doing yourself in the music business here in like the 80s and 90s?
Well, I was a promoter, as you can see. I did that show.
TV Ray Vaughan, The Chills.
Yeah, yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Mental as anything.
Yeah. So that was in the 80s. In the mid 80s, I got on the board of Greenpeace, and I could see they needed some help with their kind of their thing. They had about 11,000 members, and I was on the board of Greenpeace, and that was a Greenpeace show, which transformed pretty much, not single-handedly, but that was one of the events which really changed Greenpeace from being a small lefties, 11,000 maybe members, to 150,000 paid up members. So that was all part of that. So what I did was I joined my family business, and I helped manage Billy T. James, and Dave Dobbin. I managed him. He came along, and we managed his affairs in New Zealand, and I toured bands. If I liked them.
Yep.
That were might have been passed on by an Australian promoter, or I might have gone and sought them out, like Paco Peña. I went and sought him out because I was really keen on flamenco.
Gotcha. Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's cool. So now now that we know who you are, kind of, now we'll really find out. Return to Gandhi Road is. Yeah. So you're the producer. Your daughter is the director.
Yeah.
It's kind of your story, but not really. I mean, it's an epic. And when I was watching this thing and I was reading, hearing about this huge trek with all these ancient scripts being carried on, it's like this is an epic that's dying to be made, as Lawrence of Arabia or something.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
So for people who are unaware of the story, such as it is, give them a little overview of what this is all about.
Okay, well, putting me to one side, in the 1950s, Kangyur Rinpoche, who was a very high Lama, Tibetan Buddhist Lama, who lived in Tibet, and the Dalai Lama and there was a prediction that from the 16th century that when the iron bird flies over Tibet, the Dharma, meaning the Buddhist teachings, will go to the west. And so when the Chinese reconnaissance aircraft started flying over, the Dalai Lama and Kangyur Rinpoche decided to get all the 84,000 teachings of Buddha, which had been sitting there in Tibet safely since the 7th century, to evacuate them out of Tibet and take them to India. And the thing in between them and safety were the Himalayan mountains. And and there was 84,000 books, 2 truckloads full of them, and they carried them manually. It took them 3 years from Lhasa, basically over the top of them, through the Himalayas and safely into India, and where then they settled in Darjeeling, and that's in the 50s. And in 1971, I walked through his door. At Gandhi Road, 54 Gandhi Road in Darjeeling.
Cool. Now, I saw the footage of these texts, and they, like you said, they date back to what, the 8th century?
Yes.
I mean, you would think that they would just crumble and fall apart because they're so old. So have you actually seen them?
Yes. When we went to China, part of China, which was sort of was Tibet once, but they are there. They are there. They're in this huge sort of monastery place, and it's the size of, honestly, Marty, it's the size of Auckland. It seemed like Auckland, the ground floor Auckland Museum. I mean, massive, 84,000 wooden blocks.
Man, oh man,
all there, pristine, and
that's incredible.
Yeah, isn't it amazing?
Especially when you hear you're watching the film and realizing what they went through to get to save those things.
I know, and they had and so obviously now after having got to Darjeeling and safety, and then another transition where they went in the late 70s to France, right? Because there was a French student, a couple of French students. Actually, there was 3 French students. There was about 10 or 8 of us, or 10 altogether at one time, Westerners. And you had to be kind of tricky because at that time you weren't supposed to stay in Darjeeling for anything more than 2 weeks. So some of them were kind of hiding, and there was all that going on. But we managed to suck up as much as Kangyur Rinpoche could give us. And I mean, he didn't even tell us the story, actually. We just kind of, there are the books, he's teaching from these books. He didn't actually tell us that, that carried them all the way from Tibet.
Yep. So the film itself uses a combination of archival footage and newly shot interviews and footage and it's you as the producer, your daughter, how do you pronounce her name?
Yeshe.
She's the director. So what was it like having your daughter, working with her like that on a film like this? Well,
who wouldn't want to, what dad wouldn't want to spend a lot of time with his daughter? I mean, it was fantastic,
Yeah.
Not to say we didn't have our moments, though.
Because, I have 2 daughters myself who are adults.
Oh, so yeah, I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry, but you lucky swine at the same time.
Exactly.
It's so beautiful. And Hannah is her sister, who is also a Tibetan Buddhist. And in fact, so I'm very lucky. I've got 2 lovely daughters, Yeshe and Hannah.
So
Yeah.
what kind of conversation did you have about how this film was going to be put together? Because it's a huge story and it could have gone in any kind of direction, it seems like.
Well, it started with Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, who's a very high Tibetan Buddhist Lama, who was also a filmmaker. And he arrived in New Zealand. And by this time I was sort of out of Buddhism and was just living a life. It has sort of drifted out of my consciousness somehow over the years. But I knew the girls were back into it. Yeshe had been in France. She'd gone to France to make films, to be a director, and lived in Paris for years. And one of the lamas got hold of her, and who was living in the south of France, and said, "Oh, do you want to come down and see? We're just down here." So her mother took her daughter, Yeshe, with her. They went down as a bit of a trip down to the south to see Pema Wangjo Rinpoche, and it was one blink and you're in, and she was just gone as you do tend to, and and a similar thing happened to her other sister, in another part of the world. But Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche was a very important current teacher of Tibetan Buddhism. He arrived, he came to New Zealand. Yeshe, this was about 2009, 2010. Yeshe took me along to meet him, and we were chatting, and I thought, oh God, what have I been missing? I was feeling like drawn back
in,
to the Dharma. Anyway, but then he said, and I think you should go back to India. You really should. And to me, at that time, remember being a poor student in Calcutta was literally a hellhole. I mean, there were people in those days in the 70s. There were people dying on the streets. So it was, and the thought of it, because I hadn't been to India since the 70s or early 80s, was really pretty rough. And he said, I want you to go back to, why don't you go back to India and make a film about it? And Yeshe, why don't you make a film about your dad and his trip? And I just went, no way, no way, no way, way.
There you go.
You know what daughters were like. and of course, the Tibetan Buddhism has its way of burrowing in.
Yep. Well, it's interesting. It's kind of been in the news music-wise here a few months earlier when the Dalai Lama's birthday and his album came out, and it was basically produced by two Kiwi musicians, Janelle and Abraham Kunin.
Yeah.
So
I know. Yeah, I read that. Amazing. Yes, he's an extraordinary person, extraordinary entity.
Right. So the Dalai Lama, he doesn't really feature much in this film. It's more about these other teachers, and especially Kangyur. So
Kangyur, yes.
He passed away in what, 1975? Is it?
1975. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because no one's told the story of Kangyur Rinpoche. Many people know about the Dalai Lama. Many people know about, and how fantastic it is. But however, Kangyur Rinpoche achieved an extraordinary thing. I mean, he literally saved the Dharma, from being destroyed, from being burnt.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other parts of the Dharma that were being saved in other parts, but he literally got it all together and got it out of Tibet and got it safely into India. And the rest is, and from there, as you see in the movie, from there we go to France.
Yes. And then it was a matter of translating it, wasn't it?
It was, yes, and it still is. It's
I thought so.
84,000 teachings. So they're about halfway, I think. It's a 100-year project.
Yeah,
100-year project, because it's so precise. The translation, it's really sort of talking in sort of spiritual terms, because spirituality it's kind of it's kind of facing up with science now.
Mm-hmm.
The science of the mind. The Dalai Lama famously said, he was asked if it was a toss-up between science and Buddhism, what would you do? Which path would you take? And he said, science, of course, you fool. I mean, it's science is proof. It's been proven.
Right.
So there's over the last few years, there's been a joining of science and the Buddha Dharma, or just general Buddhism.
And that's pretty interesting, considering what's going on around the world in like the States, and people who have these conspiracy theories and they refuse to accept scientific fact because it just doesn't jive with what they believe in. And
I know.
You're talking about the exact opposite, and it just shows how people are out of sync with things.
And I'm sure they think that the Dalai Lama is a groovy cat who
Right.
sits up, up in the mountains, and he's actually a very, very studious, very intellectual, engaging, very. He's a very smart character.
Yeah.
Cookie. And so he's led Tibet and politically, and not anymore, but to a really good place. Where they are making the most of what they have.
Right. So it's an amazing story, and like I said, at some point, if David Lean were still with us today, he'd be out there shooting this thing for years and making some kind of. It's just dying to be done. But in the meantime, I mean, some of that footage and the story itself is just incredible. And having a Kiwi like yourself in the middle of it all is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I at the time it didn't feel that way, as you can see in some of the scenes. I'm ready to strangle the nearest. It's not particularly Buddhist. One's concept of Buddhist. Of course, we belong to the sort of tantric Buddhist set, and we're a little bit kind of sideways from your normal kind of well-behaved Buddhism.
Right. So has making the film kind of changed you now and reintroduced you to the whole thing?
It so has, Marty. Yeah, it really has. Yeah, I'm very much so. It literally retransformed me again. It was right. It was I just found myself going, why did you leave? How could you lose this? But of course, in those days, there was it was so some of the things that the students say in the interviews with the other students, and they were saying there was no computers, there was no. We wrote aerograms, right. So the whole thing of communication was and travel was so hard, to get to India, to make a phone call from India would take 2 days.
Yes.
To get on, and it'd be some kind of distant echo that you.
I remember that because I was born in England myself, and we grew up in the States. My grandparents were in England, and I remember in the late 50s, early 60s, we're gonna get a phone call from my grandparent, and it was exactly like that. It was like down at the long end of a well or something. You could kind of barely hear them. It was amazing.
And sometimes there was sometimes I wondered whether it was actually my parents or just somebody else, imitating them.
In the next room over, huh?
Yeah, exactly. It sounded so foreign. Yeah. So it's come a heck of a long way since then. So I suppose had I been on the whole journey, I just got distracted, and what Zongza Khyentse calls it the salad bar. I got distracted, and how when you have a buffet, and part of that's the salad bar. I spent a bit too long in the salad bar.
You got to concentrate on the meat sometimes.
Exactly.
So before we wrap up, because I don't want to give too much away about the film, because we want people to see it. What are your plans next? Do you have anything, or what are you up to?
Believe it or not, I do, and I'm working on another film about flamenco, which is has always been a passion of mine. We were raised. It's a long story, but during Dad's rehearsals in Melbourne, Mum went across the road and you saw this Lucio, this amazing flamenco dancer, and ever since then, all around our house had been images flamenco. And my brother Chris is a very good flamenco guitarist, and
great.
I was actually either going to study flamenco or study sitar. And Ravi Shankar came to town, and it was definitely going to be sitar. But yes, it's about flamenco. And there's a guy called Paul Basauda who is doing pretty much what I did, except he's in Spain. And he's become he's a well-known flamenco performer now. And
are you going to work with your daughter again in film?
No, she's gone back. I don't know what she's doing, but she's moved to Thames.
Okay.
So and during lockdown, it might as well be Tibet.
Right. That's true.
But I'm sure she'll do something else. But no, I'm working with Ian Mune, who's been a great friend of mine, and it's just such a pleasure to work with him. And of course, Fred Renata, the DOP. If we talked about making this film in 2017 while we were shooting the Buddhist film, Fred, I said, "Did you know that flamenco is from here?" No, I didn't know that. He's a muso, Fred. So that's the next project.
Sounds exciting. I can't wait to see it. Well, thank you for taking time to talk to me and turning me on to this film, because it's not one of those things that I would have normally steered myself to. I'm a rock and roll animal, but it's amazing. It's fantastic. Yeah. So hopefully people will get something out of it, and thank you very much for it.
Thanks so much, Marty.